My name is Dr. Barry Lever, and I use the term, even though I'm not practicing anymore. I was a periodontist in Pikesville, and one day in 1993, I guess it was, a gentleman, patient of mine, walks into the office, and he says to me, "Barry," he says, "what do you know about the Exodus?" And I was like, wow, I was kind of taken aback. Because, so I jokingly said to him, "Which one do you mean? Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, or the ship?" And he says, "No, the ship." I says, "I know everything about the ship." He says, "Come on, how do you know everything about the ship?" I says, "Look, trust me, I know everything about the ship because my bar mitzvah occurred the day that the United Nations voted to partition the British Mandate into two parts. A Jewish state and a potential Arab state. And that was announced on the afternoon after my bar mitzvah. This ship was the flagship of the Old Bay Line, which was the oldest oldest American bay line still in existence. In 1963, I think it shut down. But I said, so this is a very historic boat, not just from an Israeli perspective, but also from an American maritime perspective. Now, anyone who wants to really understand how the Exodus or the President Warfield became such an iconic ship has to understand a little bit about the story of the ship. I told you it had served the British. It had become the command and control ship at Normandy at the invasion of France, 30 days after the invasion, in which all ships entering and leaving Normandy beachhead had to pass through command of the President Warfield, still called the President Warfield at that time. She subsequently transported prisoners up the Seine River to Paris, or from Paris down to the Seine, number of historic things, and sailed. So it was almost torpedoed when it was turned over to the British in '42, I believe, and then it comes back to the United States, and it's ready to go into salvage in the James River Navy storage facility. It's headed for the junkyard. Now, this is where the story really becomes interesting, and it becomes a Jewish, if we can use that term, ship. At that time, the Haganah, it was right after, it was in a period in history where Britain was losing control of the Middle East. It didn't want to give up its mandate. It had lost badly in World War II. Many millions of people had died, of course, as you know, in World War II. And the British were hard placed to control the Middle East because they needed it. They needed it because they controlled the Suez Canal. It was the control of the oil fields in the Middle East, which provided the economic muscle. And they were very frightened and did not want to give up the mandate and their control over what they called Palestine. And so it comes at this juncture that the ship really becomes extremely important, because not only was there the Exodus, but there were 10 very large surplus, probably most surplus ships that went up for auction and were used and could be used to carry many refugees who were stuck in concentration camps or detention camps in 1944, 45, following the Second World War. Now, the Exodus, the President Warfield, being in a scrapyard in Virginia, was bought by a scrap dealer in Washington, a Jewish man, I think his name was Shapiro, and subsequently, out of that, was sold to the Haganah secretly and it was brought to Baltimore to be outfitted. As to the purchase of this ship, one of the things that we know is that every Jewish community in the United States, every time there was a card game, anytime people had money, they wanted to give tzedakah, they gave money to a fund that was eventually allocated to Haganah and got by way of the Sonneborn Commission to do all of the things that had to be done. Now, there are people that you will hear today who say, oh, my grandfather brought this ship. No, their grandfather didn't buy the ship. He may have contributed large sums of money, but he didn't buy it. The ship was bought from Boston by the head of the Haganah here in America, who was a lawyer. And this lawyer was the individual who signed the agreement to purchase the ship for $50,000. That's what it was paid for as scrap. Supposedly scrap, but as I say, brought to Baltimore and refitted. It was one of 4 such ships that Baltimore participated in, 4 out of 10, and these ships were re-outfitted right down here at the Inner Harbor. The Exodus, which was to become the Exodus, was refitted on Lancaster Street down at Fells Point, near Fells Point. The ship was ultimately crewed by American servicemen, by people who had some experience in Navy, some had no experience at all, but they had been enlisted and encouraged because they knew what had happened to the Jews of Europe, and they wanted to help in any way they could. So it's at that point that the President Warfield begins its transition into Exodus. Now, the issue becomes very serious, and these people are really now working for the Haganah. They're now under control of an American skipper, but ostensibly the command of this ship was under the control of Haganah. And so it sailed from Baltimore, and it set it out to sea, and there was all kinds of speculation where it was going, and it was supposed to go onto the Far East trade, to trade with China, but everybody really knew that this was a fiction in order to evade British interference. And it was only when it got to France and it began to load its refugees and then subsequently sail for Palestine at that time, because it wasn't yet Israel, that it changed its name to Exodus 1947, and that's how it was known. The ship was originally designed to carry 590 persons, and it wound up carrying 4,554 refugees, and they didn't have enough passports for them in the port of Sète where it was loaded. It was somewhere near Marseille. When they got on board, they would take their passport or their legal documents and grab them by the handfuls and take them down and give them to the new people. So maybe they had 1,000 passports which they had drawn up, they were forgeries, and subsequently everybody used them. I don't know how many actually there were, but they were used over and over and over again to get these people past the immigration officials and on board the ship. The ship pulled out under a very, very difficult situation. The British knew that they were there. The British were hounding them every step of the way, and the ship had to break through very narrow confines of the harbor in order to get out. The end result of this voyage is that the British capture the ship, and they take it, and they capture it on the high seas, and they take it to the port of Haifa. They unload it, put the people on 4 British prison ships, in spite of what they endured. The crew, some of them escaped, some of them accompanied the passengers, and they were deployed and sent to France and told to get off of these ships or they were going to be in serious trouble, and the people on Exodus refused to get off. And when they refused to get off, 6 weeks in the hot summer of July and August, they were stuck in the port outside of France, and subsequently the British took these people and disembarked them with fire hoses and all kinds of material, and pushed them back into displaced persons camp in the British zone, and that's where they stayed until they eventually got to Israel after the partition of the state. Now, the confrontation between the British ships, there were cruisers, 7 cruisers and destroyers. They then accosted the ship on the seas, and this is shown here in a drawing, which subsequently becomes a watercolor drawing, which I will show you. And this was showing the Exodus in the middle. and this is the chosen one. It's turned into a watercolor by Tom Freeman, being rammed by two British, I believe, destroyers or cruisers. And this is the events that bring the ship. The ship's people, you can see, try to fight off the British, but they're no match for the British. About 3 people die, one of the crew, and 140 people are injured. But this story goes on and on and on in newsprint and media for at least 6 weeks, and it captures the world's attention. And this is why the Exodus and its capture and subsequent treatment of the refugees that had suffered in Europe becomes such a world event. It was a print media event. Now, I want to call your attention to something very, very important here about this ship. Not only is this ship historically in its own times, but it marks a very significant juncture, because a ship begins World War II, the St. Louis, when they don't allow Jews escaping from the Nazis to land, and it ends with the ship Exodus, which is now bringing the Jewish people back to their homeland. And it's fascinating, but the word peace occurs as the 4 times in Talmud and 4 tractate, and the final word of peace is in the Talmud, the words of Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, who says, Adonai oz li'amo yitain, Adonai yavarech et amo v'shalom. God will grant you strength, and he will grant you peace. That ends the Talmud. Notice that strength, physical strength, psychological strength, the determination is first. And only when you have that will you have true peace. And that's what this is all about, the vessel of peace. Thank you very much. I hope you can use these resources effectively to teach your children the power and the dynamism that this ship holds historically, both for Baltimore and for the world. Thank you.